Fangirl is a Filipino movie directed by Antoinette Jadaone, which came out in 2020. It tells the story of a 16-year-old girl who is a huge fan of an actor named Paolo Avellino, who is actually a real person and a well-known actor in the Philippines. Avellino plays himself in the movie, although obviously and thankfully it is a fictionalized version. Anyways, this girl, through somewhat questionable means, gets to finally meet and hang out with her favorite idol, but it turns out her fangirl fantasy-fueled perception of who he is, big surprise, is pretty far from reality. This movie is a dark social commentary about fan culture and the capacity for blind allegiance and devotion to our celebrities and idols, but it is also, as I'll get to later on in this review, a story about trauma and abuse. This is definitely not a fun movie to watch in the conventional sense. It's pretty dark, and I mean like literally dark. It gets depressing and sad, and some scenes are just straight up pretty hard to watch. However, in my opinion, it is super fun to talk about and discuss, and is also just a really good movie about important issues. Fangirl gives you a lot to think about and challenges you by not pulling any punches with its depictions of harsh realities that exist in our world and societies. It's very well made, the cinematography is excellent, the acting is great, and the ending leaves you with an invitation to make up your own mind about what really happened. So I got through pretty much this entire movie constructing an analysis, which I was fairly happy with, but then the ending kind of tripped me up and left me questioning things. I went to the internet for some further insight and found a couple reviews. Initially, I was just after some interpretations of the ending, but then I stumbled upon a review that presented a theory which, if one were to buy into the theory, turns everything upside down and throws a huge twist in at the end. The theory was really strong, but it also kind of felt off to me at the same time. The fact that it kind of messed with my own analysis of the movie might have had something to do with it. So obviously I had to go back and rewatch most of the movie and look for more clues to see if the theory really held up and made sense, which was really fun. Look, I know I'm being super vague here, but I don't want to spoil the movie for anyone who hasn't seen it yet. So if you haven't seen this movie and are sufficiently intrigued, now is the time to stop this video and go watch it. Maybe come back after and tell me what you think about the ending and the possible twist. Again, I just want to reiterate, this is a really good movie. I recommend it. You probably have to be in the mood for this type of movie, but overall, really good. As for everyone else, let's get into some analysis, followed by my thoughts on the ending and the theory about the twist and how it affected my interpretation of the whole film. Alright, so let's start with the basics. This movie tells the story of a young girl who meets her celebrity idol and has her naive fantasy of who he is shattered, leaving reality standing in stark contrast. This is a story and a theme that has most certainly been used before. Celebrities are humans too, with their own flaws and struggles, and so on and so forth. Fan culture is something that can be harmless and a great thing, but can also be pretty disturbing and sad. Then, running parallel to this is another tried and true tale of the loss of innocence. Young protagonist is faced with harsh realities of the world and loses their innocence, changing them forever and pushing them towards adulthood and away from childhood for good, unable to return. Okay, we know this story. Then, and this is something I didn't really see talked about in the reviews I saw of this movie, which seems to largely focus on the first two themes, I think there is also a third theme that is intertwined with the others, which is trauma and abuse and its effect on people. It is this theme that I believe sort of lies underneath it all as the true core of the movie. I'll explain that in a bit, but first let's identify all of these themes in the film and how they are conveyed. So Jane, as we eventually learn is the protagonist's name, meets her idol, Paolo Avellino, and he's not who she thinks he is. Turns out he's kind of an asshole. Okay, well, he's pretty much a piece of shit. This disillusionment is shown through the plot, but also through the cinematography and direction. To begin with, the look and feel of the movie is designed to convey a sense of realism. Unlike the squeaky clean romantic movies that actors like Paolo appear in, which are so popular in the Philippines and all over the world as well, movies that are usually overlit with oversaturated colors and, that like blurry, glowy effect. Oh my God, I hate that so much. Unlike those movies, this movie uses more natural looking lighting and colors, practically no soundtrack or melodramatic background music except when used satirically, which by the way I thought was such a great choice, and also sports a 4:3 aspect ratio, as opposed to the more cinematic widescreen look. All of these decisions signal to us visually that this is not one of those other movies. This is real, this is reality, and this all accentuates Jane's journey through her loss of innocence and disillusionment. There are so many other details in the film that convey this sense of realness and the juxtaposition of fantasy and reality. During the scenes in the house, there are several times when Jane's fantasy or imagination paints over reality. When she is getting bandaged by Paolo or when they dance together, she imagines it as a romantic scene in a movie, and the lighting changes, the colors change, but in reality they are in a dark and dreary space. There are several other really nice uses of detail and imagery in the film through visual motifs. The director uses a lot of mirrored shots which both foreshadow and connect to other points in the movie thematically. For example, to get to Paolo's truck in the beginning of the movie, Jane hops over this little fence railing thing. This is a foreshadowing to her later climbing over the fence or gate to the house Paolo is staying in. Symbolically, it shows the degrees to which she is crossing the border between her childlike innocence and perception of her idol and a more grown-up, darker reality that awaits her. Then there is this shot where she is framed behind bars to the gate as she watches Paolo beckon her onward. It's later revealed he wasn't actually there beckoning her, and it was just her imagination. And so the framing behind bars shows visually her imprisonment in her own fantasy. There are several examples of these breaks from reality that temporarily deviate throughout the movie. Alright, so there's some ways the movie conveys our first theme. Now let's get into the second theme of the loss of innocence. One of the phrases Jane keeps repeating throughout her time with Paolo is, "I'm no longer a kid," and it functions as a verbal signal of this theme. There's a dichotomy of her both willfully wanting to be more like an adult and to be grown up, hence her unconvincingly repeating "I'm not a kid," and her unwilling disillusionment and departure from her naive perception of her idol, as well as what it's like or could be like to be an adult. And both of these are happening at the same time. Jane's loss of innocence comes through the plot, meeting her idol and him not being who she thought he was, being the overarching path she takes to get there. Along this path, there are many events, both major and minor, that help move her along the way to her complete loss of innocence. She drinks beer, tries cigarettes, smokes weed, and has sex. Remembering our theme of disillusionment and the rejection of the fantasy world portrayed in movies, these things Jane tries, smoking, drinking, doing drugs, and having sex, are all things that tend to be romanticized in movies and TV. And just like the avatar of these vices in this movie, namely Paolo, they are all shown to be not as romantic in real life as in movies. Alright, so now that we've briefly gone over these first two themes, let's move on to the theme of trauma and abuse. So Jane is a huge fan of Paolo Avellino. She's his #1 fan, in fact. But why? She thinks he's good looking, the most handsome of all. Oh yeah, and he's a good actor too, I guess. But what has transformed her into such a hardcore fan to the point where she will jump in his truck on some psycho stalker shit, smell him while he's asleep, take selfies with him while he's asleep, completely ignore everything creepy and wrong and abusive about him for a solid portion of the movie? Let me start off by saying it's completely possible she's just a big fan, and realistically this is often the case, without any sinister reason lurking in the background. But in this case, I think the movie does hint at one such culprit, and that would be her father. And look, I know what you're thinking. Daddy issues? Really? That's the best you've got? But hear me out, it does kind of connect. So we know that Jane's father left her and her mother some time ago. She really misses him and has been deeply affected by his absence and his leaving the family. So what I'm saying is, could it not be that she is trying to fill the empty space her father left behind with her obsession with another male figure, the idol Paolo Avellino? And now let's think again about that house Paolo stays in. Could we not also call that an empty space that he is literally residing inside of? It's dark, run down, hardly any furniture. It's empty and lonely. A space where so much of Jane's fantasies take place during the movie. So could this house function more as a symbolic location meant to represent the empty space in her heart, her own psychological space, which she then fills with Paolo and her fantasies, more so than a literal empty house we're supposed to believe a celebrity actually lives in? Okay, stay with me here. So now let's bring in the mom. Does she not also have an empty space in her heart that was created by her husband leaving the family? And who does she fill her empty space with? Benjo, who is an abusive asshole. Oh wait, just like Paolo turns out to be. We can also look at the scenes of Jane trying weed, cigarettes, and beer through this lens. Aside from representing her loss of innocence, they can also be looked at as ways people try to fill empty spaces. Paolo, who is clearly a deeply troubled dude, uses all three of them, as well as whatever he was sniffing in those other scenes, to try and cope with his own life. At first, I think Jane tries these things because she wants to seem grown up. But I also think, especially during the scene at the pool, she is also really desperate for something to make her feel better. However, the beer makes her throw up, the cigarettes make her cough, and the weed seems to have no effect on her. In the end, she just jumps into the pool, into this dirty, nasty water, which I thought was a really cool contrast to the typical symbolic use of water as cleansing and purification. Instead, here it is used as a further dive into the loss of innocence. This moment is then followed by Paolo and her having sex, which was so hard to watch, so uncomfortable, but also serves as the final act in her loss of innocence. Alright, so let's finally get around to talking about the ending. The movie ends with Jane heading outside of her mom's place and then calling the police. We only hear the very beginning of this phone conversation, and so we don't find out what she's calling them for or who she's reporting. Cut to black, movie over. Obviously, this leaves a certain amount of ambiguity to how things turn out. So now that it's just us people who have watched the movie, I can break down the theory I found online and we can have some fun discussing it. So some of you might already know about this theory or have come to this conclusion on your own, but for those who aren't aware, here's the gist of it. Jane never actually meets the real Paolo Avellino. She only imagines that she does, and imagines her time with him. And really, the entire time, during all the events of the movie, she was actually with her mom's boyfriend, Benjo. I know, crazy, right? But before we go any further, first things first, I found this theory in a review for this movie written by, and I'm really sorry, I'm going to apologize in advance, Nepsi Ledesma? I assume this is just a pseudonym. Anyways, all credit to them. This is not my theory. I do not claim it. I did not notice this on my own, but I do feel like it's important to add to the discussion of the film because it's a pretty convincing theory. All right, so let's get into it. In Nepsi Ledesma's review, they list several clues as to why they believe Paolo is in fact not Paolo and is actually Benjo. Here's the basics. The first thing they cite is the abandoned house, which doesn't seem like it would actually be something that Paolo would live in. Then there's the Winsboro cigarettes, which I guess are cigarettes smoked by the lower class in the Philippines that a celebrity would never smoke. There's Paolo's girlfriend in the suburbs, which I guess Ledesma is saying is actually the mom. Not quite sure what they're saying there. And then the final point, which I think is the most convincing, is that the timelines really seem to match up, with Jane being away with Paolo matching up with how long Benjo was missing and hadn't come home either. The ending is also cited with some pretty interesting parallels drawn between both characters, where Benjo and Paolo both ask Jane to go get cigars for them and also says the exact same phrase to her. While I think these points are all really solid and the theory is overall pretty convincing, I found that I was still not totally convinced. What I mean by this is, if you're gonna say that what happened still happened and the only part that was imagined was who Jane was with, then it feels like there are so many inconsistencies. There are so many scenes where Paolo being Paolo and not Benjo are referenced. So to maintain that this theory is correct, we'd have to just completely disregard those scenes, that dialogue, and say she just imagined it all and it was part of her fantasy. I guess what the theory suggests is that the entire experience was in her head and we never get to really see any of what actually happened. But it just seems to kind of disregard the whole movie and cheapen the experience, in my opinion. Okay, I need to get specific and provide examples. I think the best way to go about this is to start from the beginning. As we go along, I'll go through what I believe supports the Benjo theory and also what does not. And you can make up your own mind, because honestly, I can't say for sure yet either. So Jane goes to the promotional event in the beginning of the movie and sees Paolo, and then waits for her chance and jumps in the back of his truck. If we are arguing for the Benjo theory, we can point to several things. First, it seems weird that the real Paolo Avellino would drive away in a regular old pickup truck. He's a famous idol, a celebrity, a movie star. Why isn't he making his exit like Bea Alonzo does, getting in some big car or van with an entourage surrounding him? Then we get to the house, and are we supposed to believe the Paolo Avellino would stay at a house like that? No way. This is Benjo's spot, not Paolo's. But at the same time, if we reject this reality, then we need to provide another one that makes sense. And here's where I feel like it's equally weird and off. So if it's Benjo the whole time, are we supposed to believe that it's his truck Jane jumps into at the event? Why would he be there? Paolo is definitely Paolo at the event. It's not Benjo up there with Bea Alonzo, that's for sure. There's also shots where Paolo gets in the truck and the fans are still looking at him and calling to him. How could that be Benjo? I guess we could say that in reality, Benjo picked up Jane from the event and she just rode in the back for fun, which during my limited time in the Philippines, I've definitely seen young people do, and she just imagined she was with Paolo. Okay, sure, but then we have to say the posters in the back weren't real, the scene where Paolo is stopped by the cops never happened, and when Jane eventually returns to her house at the end, that poster that she's carrying that she still has is not real either. But you could also say in support of the Benjo theory that the poster scene was actually a symbolic event. And just like the poster of Paolo is torn away from her literally, we are also being symbolically torn away from reality, and that is the turning point of the movie, and from then on it's all her fantasy. Basically, this would mean that in reality she did get the poster and then just went home. Then there's the talk they have in the truck about Paolo's romantic situation and Jane's own story. Jane literally talks about Benjo in this scene. Why would she be talking about Benjo to Benjo? Look, I'm not going to spend all day going over this, but you get the idea. There's so much of the movie that in order to maintain a defense of the Benjo theory, we just have to hand wave and say it was all in her head. Then we come back to the argument that Benjo was missing the same amount of time that Jane was missing. This proves she was with him and not Paolo. That's pretty hard to just ignore. I'd say this is definitely the most convincing point in favor of the theory. But again, we have to make it make sense, and it just doesn't seem to quite add up. Was she with him against her will, or because she really convinced herself it was Paolo and thought she was in love? Otherwise, why would she be with her mom's abusive boyfriend, who it seems pretty well established that she hates and wants gone? Another strong point for the Benjo theory is the ending and how it could be interpreted. The fact that it is never revealed who Jane is calling the police on. For me, when I was at this point in the film, I just assumed she was reporting Benjo. But then again, there's all the shit she just witnessed Paolo do. So maybe she's reporting him, a culmination of her disillusionment and her finally accepting the truth behind her blind obsession. But if they are one and the same person, it kind of makes sense to not specify who she calls the police on, because they are in fact the same person, and the ambiguity could be serving as a kind of hint to the twist. So after looking back through the movie and considering the theory and my own thoughts, here's what I've come up with. I'm still not 100% certain, but I don't think it was Benjo all along. I tried finding interviews with the director herself and couldn't find that much, but I do know that the tagline for the movie is "Never meet your idols." And if Jane never actually did meet her idol, then what is the point of making this the tagline? There is also, as stated by the director herself, a very intentional comparison made between fan culture for pop stars and actors and political figures. The commentary being that there is blind allegiance and fandom in both spheres, where just like fans ignore evidence contrary to their perfect image of their favorite celebrities, so too do blind supporters of politicians. In fact, the director is pretty blunt with this commentary in this shot here. It seems like a very purposeful choice to not show Jane as she's calling the police, but instead to show this shot of where she just was, which just so happens to feature a poster of Filipino President Rodrigo Duterte. Not exactly subtle, but visually succinct. All of this is, of course, represented in the movie by Jane and her inability to see the truth behind her fantasy of Paolo despite direct experience to the contrary. Paolo actually being Benjo in the end as a huge twist kind of cheapens the delivery of these commentaries, and in my opinion doesn't really seem likely given the director's intentions thematically. Look, let me stress again, I'm not saying 100% sure that I can totally say the theory is wrong. It works in a lot of ways. It would fit with the theme of fantasy and reality. Just as Jane can't see the truth of who Paolo, her idol, really is, we as the audience would be forced into a similar trajectory of finding out he wasn't who we thought either, something we can't put together until the near end. That would be a really cool trick to pull to elevate the theme of having perceptions proven wrong on a meta level. Look, while I don't think Paolo was completely in her head, I do think this movie plays a lot with the juxtaposition of fantasy and reality, and I think they definitely overlap and become blurred intentionally. I agree that the house Paolo stays in doesn't fit with his image as a celebrity, but I don't think that means it's necessarily Benjo's house. I think it's supposed to serve a more symbolic, metaphorical purpose, and isn't supposed to be taken so literally. My interpretation of the ending would be something like this. Through meeting Paolo, seeing who he really is, losing her innocence, and growing up a little bit, Jane is finally able to see the truth behind her romanticized perception of him. I think this helps her in being able to finally call the cops on Benjo at the end. How? Well, okay, let's remember that Dad left. Mom and Jane both miss Dad. Mom meets Benjo. Mom seems happy again, which made Jane happy. Mom seems to have filled her empty space with Benjo. Jane fills hers with her love for her idol Paolo Avellino. Benjo begins hitting Mom and does it more and more. Jane sees this and hates it, but ultimately because her mom is still with Benjo and he's making her happy, helping fill that empty space, Jane does not call the police or go for outside help. Of course, the mom, as can sometimes happen with abuse, defends Benjo insofar as staying with him despite his abuse. Just like Jane with Paolo, perhaps she is also fighting her own battle with denial of who Benjo really is. Once again, the director does a really good job of visually conveying these themes and character development. It's definitely very intentional that we do not see the mom the entire movie and only get to see her a little bit at the end. And when we do, she is never shown in one shot or frame by herself. She is always visually behind Benjo as he blocks her physically with his arms and his body from not just Jane, who is standing there, but also the audience. Anyways, so when Jane meets Paolo, her way of filling her own empty space, she sees what he really is, an abusive asshole who ends up being just like Benjo. She sees through the incident with the woman he's with and the kid that this kind of relationship isn't real love, it's terrible and isn't worth it. It's really cool how in the film, through these scenes with Paolo, the progression is like a whole romantic timeline. They meet, flirt, have sex, and then when she is asked to go get stuff at the store, it's like they are a couple playing house. Then there's the other woman, and finally a kid. It's like this sped up quick sneak peek at adult life, or more specifically, what life would be like with Paolo. And it just so happens to be a pretty similar experience to what life is like with Benjo, and what her mom is going through. Again, this is all taking place mostly at the house, Jane's own psychological space. This ends with her finally being able to shed her fantasy version of him and see him for what he is. So when she finally gets home, now disillusioned from Paolo, she is able to make up her mind and finally do something about Benjo. The reason she doesn't call the police before isn't for Benjo's sake, it's because she knew he made her mom happy. But after meeting Paolo and getting a preview of what it's like being with a guy like that, she realizes she cannot let her or her mom be in that situation any longer. Once again, remember back to when she meets Paolo's other woman? She ends up defending her against Paolo, as if acting out a fantasy in her head of defending her mom, which it sounds like she was previously unable to do. Again, there are all these great details in the film that point to this narrative. I love the scene where Paolo escapes with Jane in the truck with the kid, where once again the fence is used as a symbolic gate to the loss of innocence. This time it's the small kid that now has to cross over to the other side, since he's just witnessed his mom and dad fighting and his mom getting hit, just like Jane. Then Jane jumps out of the truck, finally breaking free of her blind allegiance to Paolo, which mirrors her getting into his truck in the first place. She escapes holding a small child who, in a sense, represents herself and what she's been through. She is symbolically holding on to her own childhood innocence, trying to save it from the source of her loss of innocence in Paolo. Then there's the scene on the bus right after when she's finally on her way home. We see Jane have a conversation with her mom on the phone, where the mom breaks down and says, "Oh, he doesn't love us anymore. Benjo isn't coming home. He doesn't love us." And Jane says, "Yeah, he's a piece of shit. I told you." Then the next scene seems to contradict this conversation with the mom, because she's sitting there with Benjo and he's back. And oh look, he's got chicken. Everything's all good. So what the fuck? How is this possible? Here is my theory. I think that phone call never actually happened. We see that sometime before this scene on the bus, Jane's phone was almost dead at 10%. It's right after she has sex with him, meaning by the time she's on the bus, it had probably run out of batteries. When her mom calls on the bus, it now says her battery has 26%. So maybe she did charge it at Paolo's and we just didn't see. Maybe. But it is interesting, and I know I'm reaching here. I know this is probably nothing. But what is 26 minus 10? How old is Jane? Look, I'm just saying it works out. I think the phone call was all in her head, and it was really a conversation she was having with herself. He doesn't love us anymore wasn't actually in reference to Benjo, but rather her own father. It's what she feels and what she imagines her mom saying and feeling as well. Once again, you could say this is further evidence for the Benjo theory, that if this scene is imagined, then doesn't that add validity to the idea that all of this story pretty much is? So in conclusion, Jane realizes her and her mother are both trying to fill this empty space left by her father with someone else, whether it's Paolo or Benjo. She realizes by the end, these aren't great ways of going about fixing the problem of emptiness. So what's the alternative? What's the better solution? Well, I'd say it's each other. During this phone call, imagined or not, with her mom, she tells her mom that, hey, she still has her and John, which seems to be I think it's the name of the younger brother, they still have each other, and that by sticking together and being there for each other, they can get through the loss of their husband/father. Instead of filling that space with something or someone else, they should fill it with each other as a family. I think this makes sense when you look at the contrast in Paolo's life and how things end up for him in the movie. He wants to have a family with that woman and his son so badly, but he fails miserably at not only attaining it, but also deserving it. And he ends up left with nothing as he drives off in his truck. Meanwhile, through meeting him, Jane is able to realize that putting up with Benjo and his bullshit isn't worth it, even if it appears that his mom still wants to stay with him because of her attempt at filling that empty space. I think that ultimately Benjo and Paolo are supposed to mirror each other in many ways and act as devices in Jane's progression as a character, but I don't think that necessarily means they are the same person on a literal level. Alright, I doubt I'm making any sense at this point, and this is probably mostly incoherent nonsense, so I'm just gonna stop here and leave the question up to you. What did you think of this movie? What did you think of the ending? And what was your interpretation of it all? I've just shared mine, but like I said, I'm pretty sure I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about. I'm just a guy making videos on YouTube. Anyways, thanks for watching. See you next time. Love you guys. Peace.